ready to start.
Okay, thank you. And the opportunity to present an eschatology. Here a bit of double sound, but I think there may be a way to. Let's see. But thank. I will just make a start. All right. Well, on April 10, 1794, Immanuel Kant addressed a letter to J.E. Biester, the editor of the Berlinische Monatsschrift, informing him that he was on the verge of submitting an essay with the portentous title Das Ende aller Dinge. Alluding to Jonathan Swift's satirical A Tale of the Tub, Kant assures Biester that the new essay, quote, will be partly plaintive, partly funny to read, teils kläglich, teils lustig zu lesen. This essay was written in response to the ascendance of a new Prussian administration with a ravenous appetite for repression. Several months after the essay was published, Kant was officially censored by the quote-unquote self-styled Christian prince Friedrich Wilhelm II and his cohorts, who strictly prohibited him from writing on all matters pertaining to religion. This raises the question, why did Kant use the idea of the end of the world as a linchpin for his critique of the new Prussian authorities' enforcement of their rigid vision of religious truth by political means? In order to answer this question, I will first reconstruct Kant's key arguments and then show how he playfully uses the concepts of ends and means to critique the coercive policies of the Prussian regime. We'll start with the first section. I might skip a few others just to stay within time. Written during the tumultuous period of the French Revolution, The End of All Things strives to reflect upon what the expectation of the end reveals about the structure of human reason. Kant begins his essay by reflecting upon the philosophical implications that arise when thinking about the end of our finite individual life. His starting point is the common expression, as he says here, used chiefly in pious language to speak of a person who is dying as going out of time into eternity. Kant notes that this saying would be vacuous if eternity is here understood as a never-ending temporal sequence. For in such an infinite time sequence, a person would successively move from T1 to Tn without ever leaving the space-time continuum. He therefore concludes that eternity must be understood literally as an end of all time, as the cessation of time itself. Despite the absolute termination of time, he argues that human persons would nonetheless continue to exist in a manner incomparable with time, quote, of which we are obviously not able to form any concept except a merely negative one, unquote. Having sketched this brief argument for understanding eternity as timelessness, Kant subsequently re-examines the transition from time into eternity from a moral perspective. The ending of our historical lives as time-bound creatures is simultaneously the beginning of our eternal lives as what he calls super-sensible beings. As such, we are no longer subject to time and neither conditioned by physical causes. Kant therefore insists that the nature of our post-mortem existence can only be determined by what he describes as the moral order of ends. Since the super-sensible can only be understood in moral terms, he concludes that, quote, the idea of an end of all things takes its origins from reasonings not about the physical, but rather about the moral course of things in the world, unquote. And as a hinge between our historical, time-bound physical lives and our eternal, timeless spiritual existence, stands the last day, which, with its settling of accounts for free creatures, is therefore the real end of all things in time. After briefly discussing the advantages and drawbacks of two systems pertaining to the eternal future of humans, Kant comes back to the main thread and asks a twofold question that is central to his whole essay. Quote, but why do human beings expect an end of the world at all? And if this is conceded to them, why must it be a terrible end for the greatest part of the human race? Unquote. His answer to the first question is that upon rational reflection, it appears to human reason that the continued existence of the world only has value inasmuch as the rational agents in it are attuned to what he calls the final end of their existence. If, however, humans are not, for whatever reason, are able to fully realize their ultimate purpose, then the very created order itself appears meaningless to them, like a play having no resolution and affording no cognition of any rational aim, as Kant says here. For Kant, the perceived worth of the persistence of the world is thus closely aligned to the complete attainment of the highest aim for us as reasoning creatures. The second question, concerning the terrifying nature of the expected end, is in Kant's view based upon our conviction about the true moral condition of humanity. Given that our corruption is, quote, great to the point of hopelessness, unquote, it is no wonder that the omens of the last day, as he phrases it, are all of such a dreadful type. The sheer awfulness of the anticipated apocalypse is, after all, fully commensurate with the abyssal corruption of humanity taken as a whole. Indeed, Kant even laconically goes on to say that, quote, it is the only end for the greatest part of humanity that accords with highest wisdom and justice, employing any respectable standards, unquote. Following his further comment that some people see end-time signs in seemingly unprecedented moral decline and rare natural phenomena, Kant dryly remarks that it is not in vain that humans, quote, feel their existence a burden, even if they themselves are the cause, unquote. He observes in this regard that the cultural and economic advancement of humanity, as might be expected, runs faster than the pace of moral progress. This chronic imbalance is, he thinks, deeply disturbing and potentially damaging to our moral as well as physical well-being because, quote, the needs grow stronger than the means to satisfy them. Regardless of this pessimistic assessment, Kant still believes that the moral tread of humanity, which runs with a lame foot, will one day surpass the ethically debilitating forces of cultural and economic advancement. He therefore urges his readers to nourish the hope, as he says here, quote here, nourish the hope that the last day might sooner come on the scene with Elijah's ascension than with the like descent of Korah's troops into hell and bring with it the end of all things on earth, unquote. And so he also acknowledges that this heroic faith in virtue, as he terms it, is much less efficacious in altering people's behavior than the scenes of terror that are thought to precede the end of all things. I will skip this section. It's a clarificatory note in which he makes 3 subcategories of the end of all things, but you can read that in the paper. So the next section is about everlasting temporal flux and stable moral character. And in perhaps the most Adventist moment of the essay, Kant quotes the angel of Revelation 10, verse 5 to 6, saying, quote, that henceforth time shall be no more, unquote. He ironically notes that if one does not assume that this angel, with his voice of 7 thunders, he says, wanted to cry nonsense, then he must have meant that henceforth there shall be no alteration, unquote. Here, he mainly elaborates upon the argument that he formulated in the very first pages of his essay, namely how change in the world can only occur within time. For Kant, the angel of Revelation 10 therefore represents not the fulfillment of certain specific biblical time prophecies, but rather an end of all things as objects of sense. But although the termination of time implies the end of all alteration in the sensible world, Kant maintains that our moral disposition, our moral character, being itself supersensible, supraphysical, if you will, is not similarly subject to the shifting sand of temporal mutation and transformation. We therefore ought to treat our maxims, our subjective principles of action, as if our moral character is not temporally changeable, regardless of the fact that we might constantly make steps towards moral progression into an endless future. Kant gives the following example to illustrate how this rather paradoxical abstract idea is actually closely aligned with reason's practical intent. Suppose he says that eternity is an infinite temporal duration rather than an absence of all time or timelessness. And suppose further that a person is experiencing the best possible moral and physical well-being in the here and now, continually advancing towards the highest good as their final goal in life. Even if such a person would be acutely aware of the immutability of his or her moral character, she or he would not be truly satisfied, Kant insists, if their moral as well as physical condition would be subject to constant change for an infinite future duration. In other words, this is not the kind of stuff that should be contingent upon the vicissitudes of an everlasting flux, for his or her current condition will always continue to be a relative evil or suboptimal state in comparison with the new phase of moral progress that he or she is about to embark upon. From this perspective, the anticipation of an unending evolution toward the ultimate aim of the highest good is simultaneously the expectation of an unbounded series of relative evils. And although these relative evils might ultimately be compensated by an outweighing good, they will nevertheless never afford the morally virtuous actor with truly abiding contentment. Such a person could only find genuine contentment by assuming that he or she can accomplish their ultimate moral goal at some point of time in the infinite future. Well, and after these ruminations about the order of divine moral ends, then Kant says a few things about the mystical supernatural end, which I will skip now. And now we go to the third category, namely the perverse end of all things. In the final part of Kant's essay, he playfully employs the concepts of means and ends to explore the third subcategory of the end, the contra-natural perverse end of all things. His first sentence immediately sets the tone for the whole section. Quote, "The end of all things which go through the hands of human beings, even when their purposes are good, is folly," he says. "The use of means to their ends which are directly opposed to these ends." Unquote. Kant here seems to use the word end in the first clause of this sentence in the sense of a final result or outcome. And on this reading, he seems to be arguing that everything that humans manage to undertake will inevitably be contaminated by a disturbing disconnection between the purportedly good ends they seek and the discrepant means they are willing to consider to achieve such ends. In contrast to the self-contradictory nature of folly, Kant argues that wisdom consists in adopting means that are congruous with the final end of all things, the highest good. But solely God acts in such a fully consistent manner, and the single thing that might be appropriately conceived as human wisdom is when someone doesn't act ostensibly contrary to this notion of wisdom, whereas humans, through trial and error, can hope to strive towards such perfect consistency, they will never be able to do so completely. This deep discrepancy between means and ends explains for Kant the vast variety also of political theological projects throughout history that have sought to use political authority to enforce religious precepts. He thus ironically exclaims, quote, "Hence too the projects, altering from age to age and often absurd, of finding suitable means to make religion in a whole people pure and at the same time powerful, so that one can well cry out, 'Poor mortals, with you nothing is constant except inconstancy,'" unquote. These efforts to make religion simultaneously pure and powerful are ultimately based upon a profound misunderstanding of, quote unquote, the final end of all things, the ultimate purpose of free, rational, and moral agents. However, Kant, perhaps surprisingly, also holds out the possibility that there might be somewhat similar projects that are worth endorsing. Suppose, he says, these political theological projects have been sufficiently successful that a particular community has become willing to receive the pious doctrines as well as, he says, a practical reason which has been illuminated by them, which Kant adds is absolutely necessary for a religion. If the sages in such a community organize such projects as fellow citizens rather than as ecclesiastical rulers, and if most of the people in the community agree with them, based upon their own felt needs directed toward the necessary cultivation of its moral disposition, he says here, then Kant would give his go-ahead. Even though they might be on a good path, it is still uncertain whether they have chosen proper means to realize their goal. It remains to be seen whether the chosen means are exclusively directed towards morality. That's the crucial thing here for Kant. Kant, therefore, seems open to certain political theological projects on the condition that they have democratic support, or at least sufficiently democratic support, and are solely directed towards the cultivation of moral character. Yet, are such political theological projects compatible with the nature of Christianity? I now turn to Kant's final thoughts on the love-worthiness of Christianity and its incompatibility with any form of imposed authority. On the last 2 pages of the essay, Kant provides his argumentation for why Christianity has something about it which is what he calls worthy of love. And he speaks out of the moral worthiness of love. He suggests that love, which is manifested by voluntarily incorporating the will or volition of another into your own rules for action, is a necessary supplement to the deep-rooted imperfection of human nature, which we referred to earlier in the essay. With this definition of love, Kant now elucidates why the imposition of authority is inherently inimical to Christianity. Any form of authority, actually. If you add any form of authority to Christianity, whether human or divine, and even if you have the best of intentions and a supremely commendable goal, then you will nonetheless eliminate its worthiness to be loved. In this regard, Kant states, quote, that it is a contradiction to command not only that someone should do something, but that he should do it with liking, unquote. He further notes that Christ does not speak like a general who demands obedience, but rather like a friend of humanity. And this is again a quote, a friend of humanity who appeals to the hearts of his fellow human beings on behalf of their own well-understood will, of the way they would of themselves voluntarily act if they examined themselves properly, unquote. Christ can win over the hearts of human beings when they already have an understanding of the laws pertaining to their moral duties. Kant hereby foregrounds the primacy of freedom for the attribute of worthy to be loved. Quote, the feeling of freedom in the choice of the final end is what makes the legislation worthy of its love, unquote. Later on, he also mentions rewards and punishments, and he says that while Christ also announces such rewards and punishments, Kant emphasizes that these are not to be conceived as incentives or reasons for action, because otherwise these selfish motives would once again cease to make Christianity to be worthy of love. Finally, Kant, peering into the future, sketches an eschatological scenario, the basic contours of which will not be unfamiliar to an apocalyptically literate Adventist audience. And here's a longer quote. He says here, if Christianity should ever come to the point where it ceased to be worthy of love, which could very well transpire if instead of its gentle spirit, it were armed with commanding authority, then, because there is no neutrality in moral things, still less a coalition between opposed principles, a disinclination and resistance to it would become the ruling mode of thought among people. And the Antichrist, who is taken to be the forerunner of the last day, would begin his, albeit short, regime, presumably based on fear and self-interest. But then, because Christianity, though supposedly destined to be the world religion, would not be favored by fate to become it, the perverted end of all things in a moral respect would arrive, unquote. So here Kant envisions a bleak future scenario in which Christianity, instead of its gentle spirit, becomes armed with commanding authority. His theo-political critique consists of the idea that the new Prussian regime's attempts to enforce religion through political power is not only based upon a profound misunderstanding of the final end or aim of free, rational, and moral agents, but that these efforts are particularly in conflict with the moral love-worthiness of Christianity. In case this scenario would someday materialize, then far from Christianity being favored by fate to become the world religion, this would rather usher in the perverted end of all things, understood in a moral manner, namely the ultimate perversion of the true freedom-loving core of Christianity and the distortion of the ultimate aim of rational and moral agents. And now do I have some time left? Okay, then I'm doing my conclusion now. Now we are positioned to suggest an answer to the initial question. Why does Kant use the idea of the end of the world as a linchpin for his critique of the new Prussian authorities who were trying to impose their vision of religious truth by political means? Kant employs the eschatological concept of the end and its derivatives because it allows him to speak about the proper and improper relationships or connections between means and ends. And he argues that such a mismatch between means and ends is the result of a profound misunderstanding of the final end of all things in a moral sense. Eschatology is thus employed for the purposes of ethics. The end of all things as an idea of reason thus shows how theological concepts can serve as normative resources for a philosophical critique of the illegitimate use of political power. Kant's philosophical eschatology exemplifies his conception of the relationship between theology and philosophy, whereby philosophy should demonstrate the limits of speculative rational cognition and show how theological concepts can morally be put to work, so to speak, through practical reason. Kant's reflections about the regulative significance of the end of the world as an idea of reason constitutes an effort to delineate an appropriate moral application of theological concepts, which become practical in various concrete contexts. Kant's playful use of eschatological concepts ultimately coalesces into a final warning, as we saw. Written in an age in which people widely believed that Christianity was destined to be the world religion, an idea inextricably bound up with Western modernity's imperial universalist pretensions, Kant's vision of the possible future of Christianity was a bit of a shocker. But his future prognosis was not a stale prediction, but rather a prophetic warning to not let it happen. Although seemingly pessimistic, Kant's last words in the essay can be considered a prophetic call, using eschatological concepts to remind his readers of the moral love-worthiness of Christianity, which is centered in its freedom-loving core. Kant thereby challenges us to think and act in harmony with our final telos as humans, and to strive towards greater consistency between the adoption of our means and ends. In these times, from climate crisis to Christo-fascism, we can't afford to remain indifferent to this Kantian call. Thank you. I hope I kept a bit to the time. Let's see.
We are having some technical issues. Just to put it mildly. Speaker on your maybe second. Or did we fix the issue?
I think we're good now.
But you can't hear us.
Can you hear us?
Turn on your
I did.
speaker. Oh, I think I have to turn on.
Can you hear us, Daniel?
Immanuel is the host now.
I can hear you. I just muted.
Okay, so if you found a way to fix
So let's see that. Yeah.
Okay, are
I'll
we
mute
good?
mine and then you can unmute yours.
Right, okay.
Can you?
Oof, we do not know how to do this very well. But okay.
No, the problem was, we were using this for the speaker and this for the microphone. So one of us has to mute and unmute. It's
Yeah.
a complicated, yeah. It's not capturing anymore because turn it off. It's what's causing the echo. Yeah, so we are using the laptop now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what the problem was on our end?
The problem was that microphone and Marina's microphone are both operating. Yeah.
Well, all right. So aren't you happy I mentioned at the beginning about the fact that the papers are uploaded on the website? Right? That is essential, needed information. All right. So with that said, we're going to do a Q&A section presently and open it up for discussion on this deep and remarkable paper. are we still moving are we still planning on using the mic, or you said to move around, or otherwise are we doing?
I think if he doesn't hear the question, then if you could help.
Reiterate it?
Yeah,
Okay.
that would be.
Great. So a question for Daniel on this paper. Yes.
So I found the opening discussion of time and eternity puzzling, because it seemed as though at the beginning eternity was contrasted dramatically with time as the cessation of time.
Mhm.
But the person who is, as it were, enters into the kingdom somehow is conceived as having moral progress, and that seems strange. And I wondered if Kant was sensitive to that problem. And I would just add that it seems to me that any notion of the end of human being, which is so radical as to exempt us or to take us out of time, raises a very serious question about the notion of individual identity, agency, ends, and all of that. So I wonder if Daniel could talk more about that.
Were you able to hear that, Daniel? Were you able to hear the question fully?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, indeed, that is a rather remarkable concept here. But I think the key here is to emphasize that for Kant, moral disposition, our moral will, moral character, is something that is super sensible, something that's supra-physical. And that makes it something that is not subject to time. But then again, we still have the question, of course, like how can you then progress? Yeah, that is something that he does not further delineate so much in this essay. But it cannot be subject to temporal change. So it is a different type of progress. Because on the one hand, he also says like our character is immutable, and yet we can also progress. But there's a core that is even quotes Revelation 20, let him who is righteous be righteous still, and all that in a different context. So he emphasizes a core that is immutable, but also mentions indeed that we can progress, but that is not based on a temporal progression. But yeah, this stays a bit mysterious. Also to help. That's a good question. And your second question, could you maybe repeat that, please?
Well, I was just saying, I just wanted to kind of put on the table that for me, this is a very, very deep problem about the end of all things, in terms of whether or not the divine purpose is achieved for us in a way that somehow allows continuity, so that if I say you, but you are so different from what you are, what your identity is, that there really is a break, then I'm not sure that your salvation or your perfection is actually a solution to the problem that you have.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, again, he Kant would emphasize that identity in a moral sense is not based on the fluctuations of time. So if it can be argued that your identity is somehow tightly connected to your moral disposition and will, which under Kant is immutable, then your identity to that extent will also be continuous. But whether these are plausible assumptions, of course, is another matter. But I think it would be a way to safeguard a certain measure of continuity through the supersensible as Kant thinks about it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Sometimes still having some technical issues with the Wi-Fi here, so bear with us in case we ever have to ask you to repeat yourself. Jim? Yeah.
Yeah, this is somewhat related to Daryl's question. But this has to do with
the host now.
recognition of our finite human concepts and what God's eternity might be. There was an article in Scientific American last year where a significant astrophysicist speculated that the dimensions of time and space may be emergent qualities of the universe, more basic being quantum theory. So my question is, well, I'll make a suggestion and get your reaction. That we should be suspect of our own speculations about these sort of things and recognize that at best we're using metaphors about what might be the final situation.
Yishenma is the host now.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point on it, and that's exactly in the section that I skipped, what he calls the supernatural end. If we think about these things, especially in a literal way, then Kant thinks if you brood on the nature of the end in a more way in terms of efficient causes, then you will inevitably fall into mysticism, he says. So yeah, even our descriptions of the physical end that are only metaphorical. We cannot use it's only analogical, let's say, as some theologians talk about God. We can only describe it in analogical terms. That's why he also mentions this play with an end, for example. That's a way to understand, the end of the world, but more in a moral sense. The end of the world. So, yeah.
You were broken up so much that we could not understand what you were saying. Apologies. Can you try to repeat that?
How about I'm gonna try and connect to another Wi-Fi network and see if it's gonna be better. So Daniel, I'm just gonna disconnect from the projector. 1 second.
Yeah.
Daniel, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Maybe I can use my speaker.
Just put your computer up there. You will see a really so much.
Just from the speaker. Daniel, can you try to speak and see if my speaker is loud enough?
If you think it'll make a difference. Does it have the audio?
Daniel, would you mind speaking to see if my speaker is sufficient?
Yeah, does the speaker work?
Good.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yay.
Okay.
I'll just leave it.
All right. So, Daniel, are you able to just repeat the last sentence or two that you were giving in response to Jim? I know that you were talking about that section in your paper you skipped over and you were discussing, and then you cut out there at the end.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. So if you use let's say non-metaphorical language, then it is tempting to fall into mysticism, says Kant. So we need metaphors to talk about the end of the world, also in terms of the physical end. But the important thing for Kant is that this idea of the end of the world, in our culture, we think of like catastrophic destruction. We mostly think about the physical end. But this idea springs forth for Kant from moral reasoning. And that's why we can reasonably and intelligibly talk about it, because we should focus on the practical intent of the idea of the end of the world. That's the point of his essay. So if we talk about the end, we are inevitably using metaphors, but we should use these metaphors, even these metaphors, in the service of practical moral purposes.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was very clear and crisp, and we were able to hear. So yes, okay.
Well, thank you very much for the paper, Daniel. I think your language of the means, ends, confusion speaks to a lot of our ecclesial pathologists today, both outside in the public sphere and the way we do church business in the church. And with that in mind, I was almost sad to have you end the paper with the last sentence because I really got warmed up. Can you tell us a little bit more how the last sentence we talk about Christofascism and how these assessments and your major punchline of the paper, how that figures into your overall project in dealing with political theology? Can you tell us a little bit more about your thinking on these matters? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so when I read about the essay of Kant, it struck me that it had this political purpose, and it was not immediately obvious to me. So it was intriguing that the Prussian government of his time, there were new people in power, they were using their political means to censor Kant and also to promote and to enforce their own religious ideas. Well, well, that is, of course, in some ways very similar to what some people, even as we speak, especially in America, are trying to do with morality, what they consider moral Christian ideas. They want to legislate these moral or religious ideas. But then this, goes against then the liberty of people who do not subscribe to those ideas. So Christofascism is a term from the theologian Dorothy Sulle from the 70s to describe these attempts by Christians to legislate, to enforce their own ideas about morality and God onto society. So I thought this main concern of Kant is very relevant, for our world. And what we see then here with Christofascism is that people have, let's say, a purportedly good end. It seems good what they want to do. They want to serve the ends of morality, let's say, but they don't really realize that the means they are adopting are like in stark contradiction to those very ends. So their conception of Christianity is a sort of a conception of a sort of empire building religion, whereas I would say that Christianity is much more. I think now I'm citing you, Ante. It's much more characterized by an exilic consciousness, a consciousness of being a pilgrim in this earth. So I think a political theology that recognizes that would use theology more as a sort of a means to critique stark claims to power in the world, rather than to muster and to muster them up and to defend particular political constellations. So I think, and that impulse, that sort of prophetic impulse of critique, is actually quite present, I think, in this essay by Kant, and that's why I'm also generally interested in philosophical eschatology, because apocalyptic is deeply connected to this way of critiquing the world. There's an interesting book by what was his name? I forgot his name, but the book is called Apocalyptic Political Theology, and here the author uses theological concepts as a way to critique things in the world. So that shows an interesting relationship also, to come to the theme of the conference, about the relationship between theology and philosophy. And I think apocalyptic and eschatology are interesting examples that show how you can connect the two in an interesting way, but not only critical, but also very constructive. But that may be for another time. But now I've emphasized the critical aspect of it.
All right, so we have two people who've raised their hands, and we have around 3 minutes to do so.
He answered my question in the last two answers.
He did as well. Okay, so then you don't have yours anymore either. Okay, okay. Well, yeah, I saw your hand and in your hand. Okay, so.
Yeah. Hi, Daniel. We met last weekend in Florence, so my
Yes.
greetings. Thank you for remembering us through Kant, writings. That means don't need to be absolutized at the end, eventually criticize any intent of absolutizing the means. But I think that in Kant that helps, but that also introduce a problem, because one of the main problems of Kantian philosophy in this topic, but also morality, is not to be incarnated enough. So actually forgetting for instance, in moral theology, moral philosophy, the importance of motivation. So for Kant, is only necessarily the formal aspect. So it's a very abstract understanding of human reality, motivation, and what goes anthropologically deep doesn't count for Kant. So what do you think about this kind of ambivalence in moral Kant and also eschatological moral thought?
Yeah. I actually personally find it quite dangerous. It has also been said quite rightly that people in Germany, and not to hate on the Germans, but many people were grew up with a sort of Kantian notion of morality, that you should follow your duty in a formal sense, exactly, I think, as you also mean. So there's an abstract rule, you have to follow the rule. But then again, this was also, of course, one of the points that many of the people in the Second World War said, like, I was just following orders. So it was very Kantian in that sort of formal sense of the word. So you really need to have a broader conception of what kind of ends indeed you are pursuing. So the temptation for a Kantian morality is to only indeed look at the formal rule setting aspect of it, whether you can universalize your actions, whether they are consistent, let's say, but that needs supplementation also by a richer sense of which ends you want to pursue, and also what kind of creatures we are as human beings. So we're not merely rational egos or rational souls, as it were. So I think a one-sided Kantian perspective, an emphasis on rule following, can actually be very dangerous. I think you all have heard of the example of the axe murderer who knocks on the door, and Kant says that you cannot lie against a murderer who wants to murder your friend. And there's a very interesting debate on that. But I think that's an example of not taking into account maybe more aspects than just the formal aspects. But on the other hand, respect to Kant that he defended that view. But I think if you apply it in a real context, because 100 years later, there were actually people knocking on doors. And I think, if you had applied that very consistently, it's doubtful whether that would be serving the best ends of morality, I would say. But that's up for discussion, of course.